as you keep going in this psalm, you read in verses 6 to 9, because this deals a lot with location, the location for God's presence. So in verse 6 it says, "Behold, we heard of it in Ephrath." How many H's can you put in there? "We found it in the field of Jar. Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, to your resting place, you and the ark of your strength." That references the ark of the covenant. "Let your priests be clothed in righteousness, and let your godly ones sing for joy." Now, when you look at these geographical locations, Ephrath and the field of Jar, it's in reference to, it kind of references back to this time of in Shiloh, when the Ark of the Covenant was captured. There was a battle between the Philistines and the Israelites. The Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant, and it was bad news for the Israelites. The chief priest, when he heard the news, fell over and broke his neck and died. It was bad news. And when the Philistines had the Ark of the Covenant, things were going really bad for them. Every place the ark went, bad stuff happened. So they finally said, let's send the ark back. They sent the ark back, and it settled for about 20 years in this place called Kiriath Jearim. That's what they're referencing. So it's again, this whole idea of the mobile home, the temporary home, and now it's kind of transitory. And David is saying, I want to have a permanent location. I want to have a permanent location. It's been kind of ups and downs and all this, but not only do I desire God's presence, but I want to have an established permanent location. And so David, and it's interesting, so this first half of the chapter deals with desiring God's presence, having a permanent home. But then I want you to see what God does, because there's a progression here in this whole chapter. In verses 10 through 12, this is what God responds. God responds to David's desire, and he says, "For the sake of David, your servant, do not turn away the face of your anointed. The Lord has sworn to David a truth which he will not turn back. Of the fruit of your body, I will set upon your throne. And if your sons keep my covenant and my testimony which I teach to them, their sons will also sit upon your throne forever." So it's interesting because you have this progression, desiring God's presence, then establishing a location. God responds to that and says, not only do I want a permanent location, but I'm also going to talk into the future. If your kids follow after my ways, David, then I'm going to establish your kids on your throne. How many of you think that's a pretty amazing thing? And for those of us who have kids, we want our kids to follow in God's ways. I mean, the whole room is basically shaking your head. But I also want to tell you this as well. I want you to appreciate that if you're shaking your head, it's also because someone before you prayed for you. It might have been your mom, your dad, your aunt, your grandma, your uncle, somebody. A Sunday school teacher, Donna Johnson, yes and amen. Fruit from your efforts. Hello, thank you. But we're in this spectrum. We're in this continuum. Somebody prayed and believed and interceded for us before, and we are doing the same for the successors. But it's interesting because I do want to point this out to you. Eli, who was the priest, the head chief priest when the ark got captured, he was a chief priest. He had two sons whose names were Hophni and Phinehas. If you're familiar with Hophni and Phinehas, they did not serve God by any stretch of the imagination. Eli walked and served God. Now, there's ideas that he prioritized his sons over God's presence, but there's a sense that he served God. And even though he did, his sons did not. Let's look at David. David prioritized God's presence and wanted to create a dwelling place, a location. But when you look at David's kids, if you think about it, David had Amnon, David had Absalom, David had a couple others, and then David had, who is his youngest one? Starts with S, wisest man in the world? Solomon, right? And you can say, well, Solomon walked in God's ways. Kind of. Kind of. It also says that he gave up his heart for God in transaction for wives. He married 1,000 women, multiple concubines, etc., etc. I'm saying all that to say that just because you serve God and you want to dominate your kids' decisions to serve God, they get to make their own choices. They do. And that's in essence what God is telling David. Look, yes, raise up your children in the ways of the Lord, and when they're old, they won't walk from them. We've all stand on that promise, yes and amen. But appreciate that every generation makes its own decision.